Okay, we're going to be recording now. And hi, Jeremy. I think Jeremy's still muted. Okay, why don't we go ahead?
Sorry, Eric. I was just getting my lunch.
Oh, that's okay. That's fine. Looks like we've got a couple of other people joining us. Excellent. Good morning, Kelly. Okay. So, yes, Tara.
Is there a way to see the interpreter a little bit bigger? She's so tiny on my screen. Is there, Stephen, do you see?
Tara, if you, well, the interpreters are in the same room as me, but what you can do is you can pin Lauren. So if you hover over her screen, you can pin it. And I'll try to zoom in too, so that's better. 1 second.
Perfect. I didn't realize I could pin on my end. Perfect. Okay.
Yeah. Did that work for you, Tara?
Yes. Yes. Good.
Oh, that's great to know. Thank you. Okay. So I know some of you, and some of you are new to me. My name is Eric Kingston. I'm the Housing Resources Coordinator for Idaho Housing and Finance Association, and have been working with the Fair Housing Forum for many years. And I'm on the board of the Idaho Access Project with Jeremy Maxend, Dana Gover, and Diana Willis. And we've been working together on some projects over the last year, and I'm excited to reach out to this group with our final fair housing session for our FHIP grant. That's FHIP, Fair Housing and Innovative Partnerships. So I think, we have a small enough group, maybe. Do we need to do introductions for everybody? And let us know where you're from.
So who's starting?
Okay, Tara, I think Tara should start.
Okay. My name is Tara Adams. I'm most of my life lived here in Idaho, so I pretty much born and raised.
Okay, great. And Denise?
Denise Myler, I live over in Idaho Falls. I'm involved with the Silk and the Idaho Caregivers Alliance, and I'm a born and bred Idaho rat.
Excellent. And Jeremy, the infamous Jeremy Maxon?
My name's Jeremy Maxon. I'm the executive director at LINK. It's a Center for Independent Living, and I'm on the Idaho Access Board with Eric and on the Silk with Denise, and generally rabble rouse with all these folks.
Excellent. And Kelly?
Sorry, Kelly stepped away. There is actually 3 of us here.
Oh, fantastic.
There's we're all from Link, and we are all together. So I have Todd Wilder here, Kelly Dole is here, and I, Lana Gonzalez, am also here. So
fantastic. Welcome. And we have Christina Carlos also.
Hi, I'm just I work with Eric at IHFA, and I'm just monitoring the participants. So yeah.
Okay. Christina's helped with all the registration for this series, so I really appreciate her help. Let's go ahead and dive in. I will share my screen, and hopefully we can make sure Lauren is still pinned if you need to see her ASL. Okay. Is that screen share working for everybody? Is that okay? So like I mentioned, this is the last in our series of fair housing training that we started last year in July of 2020 and had a lot of training in the fall of last year, and then several training webinars in the spring of this year, and this is our last one. And the reason I wanted to do this final session focusing on fair housing, design and construction, and reasonable accommodation is in talking to friends who are really well versed in the Americans with Disabilities Act. They know Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, but in some cases they said they didn't know enough about fair housing law and the rights that they have, under that law to protect them in housing. And as you all know, housing is very expensive right now, and it's really difficult for people to find housing. So I think it's even more critical to understand what rights you have and maybe help clients and folks that you work with to understand their rights as well. So I just want to do some thanks to folks here, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development for their support of this project, the Idaho Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, and Lauren and Stephen. So thank you very much for helping out with ASL today. Dave Penny, who provided some of the training materials that I've used and repurposed for this session. Fair Housing Affordability First is a group that we've worked with in Idaho over many years, and they're kind of the experts on design and construction under the Fair Housing Act. And then, of course, IHFA's Marketing Communications team and Christina Carlos. And I'm going to read through the text on these slides because we are recording this and we'll be saving it so that people who might be blind or low vision that want to experience this video can kind of follow along that way. So I hope that's okay. The work that provided the basis for this publication and event was supported by funding under a grant with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. The substance and findings of the work are dedicated to the public. The authors and publishers are solely responsible for the accuracy of the statements and interpretations contained in this publication. Such interpretations do not necessarily reflect the views of the federal government. That's the official disclaimer. It sounds very official, I think. Please note, we are recording this for future reference. We'll send participants a link to the video, chat, and materials in the coming days. And let's see. Okay, I'm going to skip it over and I'll put captions in the final video, I think. Today's session is divided into several brief sections. We're going to cover fair housing basics, just a really brief overview, fair housing design and construction requirements, reasonable accommodation and modification, issues surrounding retaliation and harassment. And then I'm hoping we have some time at the end, and I'd like to hear from you in the audience and find out what you or your clients are presenting with, in terms of fair housing issues or problems finding or keeping housing. Basically, this is the kind of the overview, why it matters. Fair housing laws give all Americans the right to live where we choose and where we can afford. And like I mentioned earlier, that affordability piece is really critical these days. And so that's been more challenging than it has been since I've been involved with this project since 1997, I think. This housing choice affects our access to essential community assets such as quality healthcare and education, transportation, clean air and water, healthy food options, public services, retail, and recreation. Housing choice increases independence, economic mobility, productivity, community stability, and it translates into lower taxes. Ultimately, this benefits Idaho and America. And I will send out a link to everybody that participates today. We recorded a series of first-person videos, video interviews, and one of those, or a couple of those videos featured Jen Grushdale from Link, and she talks about the lower taxes piece, and I think you'll all appreciate it. Jen always does such a wonderful job with that kind of stuff, so I think you'll like it. Okay, fair housing basics and protected classes. Fair housing laws are federal, state, and local laws that prohibit housing discrimination. It is illegal to treat a person differently in a housing transaction because the person is perceived to be a member of a protected class. And I know I've used this analogy before, but my first wife was evicted from a rental that she had in Logan because the neighbors thought she was African American. She's not, but they perceived her as someone who was Black and complained to her landlady. And so it's that perception of a protected class that can be a fair housing violation as well. The protected classes include race, color, religion, national origin, gender, which now includes gender identity and sexual orientation, familial status, or families with children, and disability. And I want to note that language is not a protected class, but because language is so tightly linked with race and national origin, it can be a fair housing violation to prohibit, to keep somebody from renting housing or discriminating against someone because of language alone. It can be linked to a protected class. So what are the prohibited actions? Refusing to rent, sell, or finance, otherwise known as a denial of housing. Refusing to give information, discouraging someone from renting, or lying about housing availability. Applying different rules, privileges, standards, and/or qualifications. Applying different rules in evictions or services. Making discriminatory statements, whether those are spoken or published. Steering someone to a certain neighborhood, building, or unit. That could be, it might be well-intentioned where a landlord or property manager is showing property to a family with children, and they say, we have an available unit that looks over the playground in back of the complex. The idea is you have to show tenants all available units and let the tenants decide where they want to live. So harassing, intimidating, threatening, or coercing anyone, putting any pressure on anyone, or retaliating against someone for pursuing their fair housing protections. And retaliation is a big deal. And we're seeing that, again, because of the housing crisis right now, we're seeing that as being more and more of a problem. Design and construction requirements, what's covered? And so this is really design and construction relative to the Fair Housing Act. And it's different from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which covers areas of public accommodation, communications, education, things like that. This is really specific to housing. And it's also different in some ways from Section 504. It's really unique to housing across the board. So what's requirements apply to multifamily dwellings designed and constructed for first occupancy after March 13th of 1991. And a dwelling unit is defined as all housing for sale or rent, whether publicly or privately funded, an apartment, a single family unit in buildings with 4 or more units, a room where people sleep, including housing with shared facilities. And that shared facilities can mean dormitories, boarding houses, assisted living facilities, transitional housing, or homeless shelters that are used as a residence. It could include condos, timeshares, etc. And for homeless shelters, the benchmark is if someone has an expectation of returning night after night to stay in a shelter, it's considered a dwelling. And I think there's some specifics there that we won't go into, but I can tell you where to get more information on that. All units in elevator-served buildings with 4 or more units, all ground floor units in non-elevator buildings with 4 or more units. So anything from a 4-plex on up is covered under the Fair Housing Design and Construction requirements. So what are the 7 design and construction requirements? An accessible building entrance on an accessible route. So you can park a vehicle or take the bus and get off at the bus stop and have an accessible route to the building and into the entrance of the building. accessible public and common use areas. Those can be also covered by the ADA. Usable doors, and these are doors usable by a person in a wheelchair. And I would include maybe, lever hardware that's, that someone can use with a closed fist, to open and close a door. That's generally something that we look for. An accessible route into and through the dwelling unit. Light switches, outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls should be in accessible locations. Reinforced walls in the bathrooms to accommodate grab bars. So somebody that needs to use a grab bar for a transfer from a wheelchair to the toilet or the tub, those have to be pretty sturdy. And then usable kitchens and bathrooms. And I just want to take a pause in case anyone has a question or needs clarification on anything. Okay.
This is Steve. I do have one quick question.
Yes.
I know a lot of the things you've mentioned have applied to apartments. I'm wondering though, for private homes, if someone owns a home and decides to rent it out, do those same requirements apply in that situation?
So if we go back to the buildings that are covered, again, you see this stipulation of buildings with 4 or more units. So if you own a single family rental, a duplex or a triplex, then you're not going to be covered under certain elements of the Fair Housing Act based on this definition. I always advocate to people that they consider any requests for accommodation, and we'll kind of get into reasonable accommodation a little bit later, but those are some things to consider. So also there's some exemptions if you share space, if you share an entrance, and you're renting out, say, a basement unit in your home, or an attic or a duplex. There are some exceptions there. So does that help?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So how does HUD define disability? I know we have the ADA and Section 504, and HUD's definition of disability is can be defined as any individual, 1, with a physical or mental condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities, 2, with a record of such condition, or 3, who is regarded as having such a condition. And there I've changed the wording that HUD uses. Instead of impairment, I put in condition. So I've substituted that because some of the folks I talk to, they don't like the term impairment. So I've kind of adopted that in some of my work. Physical or mental conditions may involve mobility, vision, speech, and hearing, or neuromuscular systems. Can involve cancer, heart disease, diabetes, human immunodeficiency virus or HIV, developmental disabilities, mental illness, PTSD, depression, anxiety disorder, and drug addiction or alcoholism. And there's an asterisk with drug addiction and alcoholism, and that refers to somebody who's in active treatment or recovery is protected under the Fair Housing Act, by this definition. If somebody's actively using drugs or drinking, there might be some distinctions there. So but anybody who is in active treatment is protected. Major life activities as defined by HUD may include walking, speaking, hearing, seeing, breathing, working, learning, performing manual tasks, and caring for oneself. And I think the folks on this webinar, you guys are really familiar with all these definitions. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, but I want to make sure that for the recording purpose, and people who look at this later or experience this later, they can get a hold of that stuff. So what's prohibited specific to disability? You're prohibited from refusing to let a person with a disability make modifications necessary to use the dwelling, or refusing to make reasonable changes in rules, policies, practices, or procedures so that a person with a disability can use and enjoy a dwelling safely. And those are really the basic things to keep in mind. There are some exceptions to that, which we can talk about a little bit later. The federal laws that protect people with disability in housing, I mentioned the top three. Fair Housing Act is the one we're focused on, but also, and that protects individuals in all housing situations and transactions. Then there's Section 504 that protects individuals with disabilities in any publicly funded housing. And then the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act, protects individuals with disabilities in areas of a residential building open to the public, such as rental offices or community facilities. So those are how those three laws kind of break down and cover different aspects of housing. Protections for tenants or applicants with disabilities. First of all, applicants with disabilities cannot be asked questions about their disability. You can't, a landlord can't ask about the nature or severity of a disability. Tenants can only be asked the same questions that all applicants receive. Any information an applicant with a disability provides to a landlord or a landlord's representative about their disability must be kept confidential. Finally, some tenants with disabilities may have unique needs and require a reasonable accommodation to the rules and policies or a reasonable modification to the dwelling, so they will have an equal opportunity to use and enjoy the dwelling and common facilities. So, reasonable accommodations are requested for an exception to a housing provider's rule, policy, or practice. The individual with a disability must establish two things. First, the accommodation is necessary because of his, her, or their disability. And second, the accommodation is necessary to access, maintain, or have full use and enjoyment of the housing. Examples may include a request for a service animal or emotional support animal, also known as an ESA. It might be a designated parking space. Somebody with a mobility, limited mobility, or with PTSD or anxiety disorder may need a parking space very close to the front door of their unit, or near a walkway or a curb cut. Third, consideration of other conditions, including accommodation for caregivers. So if you have caregivers that come and go throughout the week, that's an accommodation in terms of guests visiting. Or if you have a caregiver that is a live-in caregiver, again, that's an accommodation. Or the use of equipment needed in connection to the disability. So you may need an additional space to accommodate equipment that's required based on your disability. So reasonable accommodations continued. These are some more things to consider. Tenants are responsible for requesting any accommodation from their landlord. And this one came up. A friend of mine, she and her mom rented a house for many years, and she used a guide dog, and her guide dog was being retired, and she had a new guide dog coming online. And so she had the retired guide dog and the new guide dog, and the landlord and property manager charged them $1,000 pet deposit and stipulated that was to cover the two black dogs that she had in the unit. And clearly, most people know that would be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. She was unaware of that at the time. And it wasn't until about 10 years after the fact that she learned what her rights were in that situation. So, I think that puts things in a difficult position to make that request 10 years after the fact. Clearly, it was a violation, but it's important to know these rights, ahead of time, and then take action, when you find out that there might be a violation. Second bullet: landlords may ask for verification by a reliable third party that's in a position to know about the tenant's disability and a connection to the requested accommodation. So this doesn't have to be a doctor or a medical professional. It can be a family member, clergy, counselor, therapist, somebody that's in a position to understand the person's disability and the need for the accommodation. A housing provider cannot require the release of medical records. Providers and tenants may explore alternate solutions to achieve tenant goals. So you may have a reasonable accommodation request, and the landlord might consider that and then come back with a counter, a proposal that might meet your needs as a tenant and be more cost effective or have, fewer impacts on the nature of their business or property. So there can be some back and forth and some negotiation there, but that's something that can be pursued. Exceptions for certain housing providers might involve a requested accommodation or modification that poses an undue financial or administrative burden, or that creates a liability or hazard, or that changes the nature of their business. So you might have a request for an accommodation and say, I'm on certain medications to control anxiety or to help me with memory, or there might be some other medical conditions. To ask a housing provider or a site manager to manage your medications, that would be a significant departure from their focus, their business focus or area of expertise, and it could expose them to some liability. So, there are things that can come up that a landlord might say, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. So there are exceptions. So when I mentioned earlier that landlords can ask for verification of disability, verification is not needed if the disability is obvious without any special expertise or knowledge. So if somebody shows up and they're using a manual or a powered chair, they have a service animal, a guide dog, they use a white cane to navigate, that's a fairly obvious indicator of a disability, and it's not necessary to ask for verification in that case. Other disabilities might not be apparent, and so the landlords can ask for that documentation. So let's talk about assistance animals, and we're going to talk about broad definitions. An assistance animal is an animal that works, provides assistance, or performs tasks for the benefit of a person with a disability, or that provides emotional support that alleviates one or more identified effects of a person's disability. A trained service animal or an emotional support animal are not considered pets subject to a no pets policy or a pet deposit, like I mentioned earlier. While there are some distinctions, both are protected under fair housing law. There was a landlord in eastern Idaho several years ago who reached out to ask about the definition of a service animal. And when he found the definition provided by the ADA, the Access Board, and the DOJ, he said, oh, this person's requesting an accommodation, but I know her animal has not received any specific training. It's just a pet. So he denied the request. What he didn't realize is that she was requesting an accommodation for an emotional support animal. Those don't require training. He was focused on the term service animal, and that's why he denied it. He ended up getting sued, having a complaint filed for violating her rights. So those terms are very important. So remember, service animals are individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. Emotional support animals provide comfort to help relieve a symptom or effect of a person's disability. Both are considered assistance animals under the Fair Housing Act. And I know those terms get used interchangeably a lot, and I just want to make sure people pass that information on to others. So let's talk about reasonable modifications. Private housing providers must allow individuals with disabilities to make structural changes so that the individual has full use of his, her, or their residence. Examples may include a wheelchair ramp, wider doorways, grab bars, or a roll-in shower. First example, private housing providers can require the individual with a disability to pay for the cost of modification. 2, under different laws, a publicly funded housing provider may be obligated to pay for reasonable accommodations. So then it depends on the funding source for that housing. If it's private housing, the tenant may need to pay for the modifications. If it's publicly funded, oftentimes the housing provider has to cover the cost of the modification. Number 3, housing providers have the right to request that modifications be done competently and with a permit if the local jurisdiction requires a permit. So this might involve widening doorways, changing an entry, putting in a ramp that's, complies with, slope requirements and cross slope and has a hand railing if necessary. Finally, landlords can require tenants to remove interior modifications after tenancy and can require the tenant to pay for the cost to restore the unit to its original condition. And in some cases, when Idaho had I think it was the AIP, Assistive Improvements or Accessibility Improvements Program, there was funding available to make modifications to rental units or even owner-occupied homes. And sometimes that was a ramp. And if the landlord asked them to remove the ramp after they moved out, there would be money placed in an escrow account that could be used to remove the ramp after the tenant left. So that's an example of how that might work.
Eric,
yeah,
this is Denise. Can I ask a question on that?
please.
What happens if you're a person that requests a modification and the landlord wants to set up an escrow account so that, say it's a ramp, and when you leave, he wants that to be removed, but you're on such a tight financial budget that you don't have any extra money to put in the escrow account? Who puts the money into that?
That's a really good question, and it points out the need for renewed funding, statewide, to make that happen. And that's something that that's one of the reasons I put in this link to the Idaho Home Modification Resources down at the bottom of this slide. This is managed by Krista Kramer at U of I in the Idaho Assistive Technology Project. So that she's got a resource list to help people that need that need that adaptive modification. And there are different funding sources listed there, or other resources that can help people with that. But it's a really big need statewide, and you're absolutely right. For someone on a fixed income, that represents a pretty huge investment, and it's money that's diverted from other essential needs. So I think that's a great question.
So if you can't put money into an escrow, if you need a modification, can a landlord then deny you the apartment?
That's
and
a
still
question.
build within fair housing?
I would defer to Intermountain Fair Housing Council or someone who's a trained lawyer on that question. But I think it's a really good question.
Hey, Eric, we have worked with a couple of individuals who are in halfway houses or trying to re-enter the community. And they need accessibility and are fearful of kicking up any dust because it's their housing and there isn't a lot of options. And I know that you're going to cover retaliation, and I know we need lots of resources, but there's also this problem where people are just terrified to get the accommodations they need for fear of losing housing because there isn't housing available. So we're kind of coaching people through those kinds of experiences as well.
And you're absolutely right. That's the reality right now. And when you have such a tight housing market and costs are going up, every week, and the availability of housing seems to be shrinking relative to demand, that's a legitimate concern. And it's easy for me or for somebody else to say retaliation is against the law. You can file a complaint based on retaliation. But for someone in that situation, that's going to impact them very directly. And so, I agree with you. That requires a lot of faith in the system to file that complaint. You're right.
And when the system hasn't always been there for them in the past, it takes lots of coaching sometimes.
Agreed. Yeah, it's a challenge, I think. And I think it's important for people to understand what those rights are. It's also important for them to connect with an agency like the Intermountain Fair Housing Council or Idaho Commission on Human Rights, Legal Aid Society or HUD, or Legal Aid Services, and that's where they can kind of build that relationship and knowledge of those rights and what their process should look like. You know, how they can proceed and document everything in a way that protects them in a retaliation situation. So it's a challenge. So let's talk about protections against sexual harassment in housing. And this is kind of a segue to this conversation. The Department of Justice actually launched a specific program to combat sexual harassment in housing transactions that coincided with the pandemic and the housing crisis and economic recession, because they were hearing a lot more complaints, mostly from women, where tenants were being pressured, harassed, based on gender, pressured to perform, have sex with landlords or housing providers, and it was a huge issue. So there's a whole section in the DOJ website and on the HUD's Fair Housing site talking about sexual harassment training, and I've got a link here. So I'm going to read through this slide real quickly and then refer to that link. The Fair Housing Act prohibits gender-based housing discrimination, including sexual harassment, which can take two forms. I've kind of talked about those. The first is quid pro quo sexual harassment, where a housing provider requires a person to submit to an unwelcome request to engage in sexual conduct as a condition of obtaining or maintaining housing or housing-related services, like maintaining the property, fixing your heater, fixing your refrigerator, the toilet, etc. And number two, it can be also a hostile environment sexual harassment, where a housing provider subjects a person to severe or pervasive unwelcome sexual conduct that interferes with their sale, rental, availability, or terms, conditions, or privilege of housing or housing-related services, including financing. So anything to do with housing, if there's any kind of pressure, either overt or indirect, involving sexual harassment, it's against the law, and you can file a complaint. And again, very sensitive issue when housing is so tight. You can learn more about these protections and HUD's Sexual Harassment Training Initiative, and I've got a link there at the bottom of that slide. And so for you service providers like Link, you can actually go through that training that HUD provides to learn more about steps you can take if a client or somebody you know is experiencing that kind of discrimination or harassment, and they'll kind of walk you through the steps there. Protections against retaliation. There we go. It has its own slide, Lana. It's Lana,
I should
right?
have waited. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. No, that's fine. It is illegal to harass, threaten, or retaliate against any individual exercising their right to pursue fair housing or participating in any complaint. So it even applies to somebody who's testifying in a fair housing complaint. If they face retaliation because of their testimony, that's against the law. Hello there, we got a new person. Okay, so third bullet item, if you believe, the Fair Housing Act protects any person who has reported a discriminatory practice to a housing provider or other authority. And finally, if you believe you have experienced such retaliation, you can file a separate complaint. Filing complaints, the steps you need to follow. If you suspect your rights have been violated, you may file a complaint. There are time limits on filing a complaint after an alleged violation. Submit a complaint as soon as possible. So as soon as you suspect that your rights are being violated, document everything, and then take steps to learn how to file that complaint with the right place, whether that's Intermountain Fair Housing Council or HUD directly. Provide as much information as possible, including your name and address, the name and address of the persons or organization your complaint is against, the address or other identification of the housing or program involved, a short description of how you believe your rights were violated, and the dates of the alleged violation. So I mentioned that example of, the reasonable accommodation violation when the landlord charged you know, $1,000 for a pet deposit for a retired guide dog and an active guide dog. Because 10 years passed, it complicated the process of filing a complaint. So make sure you get on that as soon as possible. What to do if you suspect a fair housing violation. If you suspect discrimination in a housing transaction or a provider refuses a request for reasonable accommodation or modification, you have several options in Idaho. You can call 211 and ask to be referred to a fair housing resource, or contact any of the following directly for information. And I've got several listed here. First, Intermountain Fair Housing Council, and their number is 800-717-0695. And there is a direct link to their online complaint form. The Idaho Commission on Human Rights, their number is 888-249-7025. And again, I've got a direct link to their online complaint form. Third, HUD Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity Office, their number is 800-877-0246. And they also have an online complaint form. And finally, Idaho Legal Aid Services, they refer complaints to these other three, but they do provide general legal advice and information, including on landlord-tenant law. They're a great resource, and their number is 208-746-7541, and that will connect you with any of their regional offices in Idaho. What else should we explore? Many fair housing violations in Idaho consist of either a physical design and construction barrier, like a ramp or a narrow doorway, or the denial of a reasonable accommodation or modification request. And this is based on, what I hear from my colleagues with Intermountain or other folks dealing with complaints. Barriers to housing access can involve mobility, hearing, vision, neurodiversity, developmental or mental health issues like depression, PTSD, anxiety, etc. Barriers can also include land use planning or policies that exclude people with disabilities. And that's something that the Idaho Access Project is working on. Maybe after we finish the slides, Jeremy can talk a little bit about what the Access Project is working on in terms of land use planning and policy. So here's some questions that I have for you guys. What have you experienced? What about your family, coworkers, or clients? Things that you're hearing about on a regular basis. What do housing providers and policymakers need to know? What messages would you like to have housing providers understand and internalize? How do housing barriers affect people living with disability? We know that in general, people that live with disability tend to have lower household incomes, and that creates kind of a disparate impact, on those protected classes. What can we do to support independent living for more Idahoans? How can accommodations and modifications benefit individuals and our economy? And finally, what's missing from the conversation? So I'd like to, I've got a few other slides, but I want to, before I continue with those slides, I kind of like to open it up and hear what you all are thinking and hearing about from clients or families and friends. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.
This is Steve. I've noticed every once in a while at our agency at the Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, we receive some complaints for the deaf and hard of hearing community. And some of the complaints have been quite interesting. One of them was regarding an apartment, and the apartment walls were very thin. And in one of the units, there was a bedroom where a deaf person was residing, and they used a vibrating alarm clock. And that vibrating alarm clock was affecting the person who was on the other side of the wall from them on the other unit. So that person who could hear would then go complain to the deaf person saying that their vibrating alarm clock was too loud, that it was interfering with their sleep. So that deaf person reached out to us not knowing exactly what to do, since that was an appropriate accommodation. especially since that complaint came from a person who didn't have a disability but was a neighbor to them. What we have also noticed is within deaf culture, one way that deaf people get someone's attention is by tapping their foot on the floor or tapping their hand on a table. And what we've heard from tenants is if they're living on a second or third floor apartment, that the neighbors below them complain. And so I'm wondering how this applies then to fair housing. Is there a way that we can address this? I had referred them before to some of those resources, and I'm not sure how that panned out. Are there any limitations on how an accommodation would interfere with other tenants who are living in that building, such as like that vibrating alarm clock?
Those are really interesting questions, and I can picture that challenge. So just on a personal level, I would always advise having the tenants get together and explore a solution that works for both people, for both tenants. Clearly, there's a reasonable accommodation involved in using that vibrating alarm clock or in, communicating, to get someone's attention, tapping or stomping on the floor, that kind of thing. And so I guess aside from exploring those mutually beneficial or mutually acceptable solutions, it's important to also know that if the complaints from the other tenants rise to the level of harassment or threats, then that can become a fair housing violation. And it's important to connect with the site manager of the apartment or the property management company and let them know what's happening. You're trying to work things out. But if they're aware of harassment or retaliation or threats from another tenant and don't take action, they could be liable in a fair housing complaint. So it's not just harassment coming from the housing provider against someone with a disability or in a protected class. It can be tenant on tenant harassment, and housing providers have an obligation to help resolve those conflicts. I'm not sure what they can do in this case. I'd be interested in hearing, other thoughts.
And this is Steve. I would say that it's similar to if someone has a guide dog who's barking. So does the landlord have the right then to ask that tenant to leave if their guide dog is always barking, even though that is a reasonable accommodation? So kind of something along those lines.
Right. So even though an assistance animal, which could be a service animal or an emotional support animal, they're not considered pets. You can't charge a pet deposit. The tenant still needs to adhere to the terms of the lease agreement. And part of that lease agreement means not interfering with the peaceful enjoyment of the other tenants. So anything that is a threat to the health or safety or peaceful enjoyment of other tenants can be considered a lease violation and could be grounds for eviction. So that's something to be thinking about. It also applies to picking up pet waste. So around the apartment complex, if somebody's letting their dog or other animal, use the grounds, the common areas as a bathroom, and they don't clean up after their animal, that can be considered a lease violation. And I remember pointing out that an accommodation can be denied if it represents a departure from the business focus of the housing provider. So it might not be reasonable to say to a site manager, I need you to pick up after my dog. Same kind of thing applies there. So I'm not sure, as far as the barking dog goes, if it's bothering other tenants and you would, it would be grounds for eviction under a lease violation. about the only thing you could do is ask for an additional accommodation and try to remedy the problem. Again, I'll defer to Intermountain Fair Housing Council on that. They're the lawyers. I'm not a lawyer.
Eric, this is Jeremy. I just wanted to kind of amplify a message I heard from you and Lana in terms of the folks that we see coming through Link. You know, in the past, like 30 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was a renter in Boise, I would face trying to find an apartment here or there, a house or something, you know, subtle forms of discrimination, like when you want to build, you know, when I wanted to pay to build a simple wooden ramp to get into an apartment or something that would work for me, you know, quickly, you know, things would change with the landlord and that wasn't available now. And so you play that game. But 25 years ago, you could play that game because there was flexibility. I could choose to not live in an apartment or a house that had a landlord that was kind of a jerk, or you could just tell was going to be a problem. There was housing stock available to go find an alternative until you kind of found the right person, the right landlord, the right apartment. And today, with the housing situation so constrained, it's so important that all the systems are working really effectively, like that, you know, agencies and organizations are providing the training and the skills and the peer support to people to be effective self-advocates. Like it sounds like Lana's, you know, and her team are working on helping people navigate that, because, you know, you can advocate too strongly and then end up in a bad situation without housing, because that's just a reality. But also when a complaint is filed, like it's really important that there's quick and strong and very clear enforcement so that landlords, you know, are aware that they can't do what they're doing, particularly in this current environment, because you don't have options. You can't go out and pick and choose. I mean, really, you're kind of stuck with whatever you find at this point. And so, you know, I think just top of mind for me after hearing this is just how important it is to make sure self-advocates know what the resources are, know what the laws are, know how to effectively communicate with a landlord, but hold your ground. And then like you said, it's really up to relying also on these systems to respond in a fast and effective way to shut down landlords who pull that kind of nonsense. So it's a really precarious situation right now for people. And all of these systems really have to be working together really well for people to really get into housing, those that can, because there's just a lot that this isn't happening for them. They're not getting housing.
Right.
So
Can I ask a question too, Eric? Like, sorry, Jeremy, if you weren't done.
Oh, I'm done now, Lana.
Okay. Is there a statute of limitation? So if an individual we're working with doesn't want to kick up dust or file a complaint, when they move out, what is the statute of limitations? Because for me, I want to hold landlords that are doing these kinds of things accountable. But so is there a statute of limitation? So after the contract ends and the individual moves out, can they file a complaint? I know your slide said as soon as possible, but sometimes they're still residing there. So that's my first question. And I've actually had an experience where my landlord or my property manager doubled my deposit when they met my child with a disability. So they had a really great excuse for why they all of a sudden decided to double my deposit. And but I'd already had a documented offer. So I'm just wondering about the statute of limitations.
I wish I knew. I'm going to I'll defer to Intermountain Fair Housing Council, and what I can do is find out if there is a statute of limitations on that, and then I'll email everybody that's participating in this, and I'll also post it along with the recording of this session. And I'll be posting this, all the information that we have here, on fairhousingforum.org, and I'll send everybody a link to that. I've got a special page for that. I just noticed a comment in the chat from Kelly. She says, I believe we would benefit from this information. Let me just expand that a little bit. Being more widely spread. Realtors, property managers, housing authorities, This would make for a great local commercial Idaho PBS special. So who are the local ladies that share and promote local community projects and education? Just a thought. And I agree. So just so you know, Kelly, we have been providing fair housing training like I said, for the last year or so. And we've specifically included lots and lots of property managers and housing providers, lots of realtors, and a lot of people in the industry. So they are getting this message. They're also receiving training from Intermountain Fair Housing Council and some other sources. But you're absolutely right. They need to receive that training on a regular basis because those industries have turnover and new people may not know, may not have received training before they start interacting with the public. So it's important to have frequent training. I want to follow up on something that Kelly and Lana mentioned, and that is this issue of, it goes back to that statute of limitations, but also the reluctance some tenants might have around filing a complaint because of fear of retaliation. When I started tracking rental vacancy rates around the state of Idaho, the rental vacancy rates in, say, 2003, 2002 around the state were sometimes between 10 and 15%. That's a pretty high rental vacancy rate. And that means that tenants had a lot of choices for where they could go. If the landlord wasn't competing for their business, they could go somewhere else. In 2011, the rental vacancy rate statewide was 5.47%. Today, that same statewide rental vacancy rate is 0.4%. And in many counties like Ada County and Canyon County, that rental vacancy rate is effectively 0. You might have 3 or 4 listings that are available out of 6,000 or 7,000 in Ada County right now. And these are listings that are affordable to people who earn the equivalent of $20 an hour or less with a full-time job. So that market creates a real problem for tenants. And it means that tenants are much more dependent on landlords doing the right thing for the right reasons. And it means that a lot of people are going to behave just like you're saying. They're going to be really reluctant to file a complaint. Thanks, Denise. Appreciate your participating. So that's a real problem. And a healthy rental vacancy rate is between 5 and 7%. That leaves enough capacity for tenants to have some housing choice, and rental, rents don't drop too low and they don't go too high. But when the rental vacancy rate is near 0, that's when you see prices go way up, and you see landlords and providers becoming much more discriminating in a broad sense, and much more selective in terms of tenants. So it's really a problem.
Eric, can I also add that
Please.
when you factor in mobility kind of challenges in terms of access, like your available housing stock immediately, I don't know what the percentage is it gets cut by, but it's probably get down to like 15% of the stock is even something you can consider as a possible housing solution for yourself. And so the market right now is not solving this problem for people with disabilities. Like, it's just, the market is broken. And so in addition to like the landlords or the property owners or maintenance companies, I also think it's probably in our best interest to make sure we're communicating effectively with municipal governments and other lawmakers or decision makers about the problem, because the free market is clearly not creating opportunity for people with disabilities. And that's why we have a government, right? Like, that's why we pay taxes, is so we can solve problems like, where are we going to get clean water, and how do I go get a hamburger and not die from E. coli or something, right? And housing is the same thing. And it's like, the government needs to understand, they know there's a housing problem, but they know there's a housing problem through the lens of just people in general without disabilities.
Right.
And I don't think they really understand how dire the situation is when you've got 0.04% of the availability in rental. That's virtually, there are no housing options for people with certain disabilities. They just don't exist. They're non-existent. And
Right.
I think we should not necessarily obviously here, but like this conversation, how do we plug into conversations where we can contribute information to decision makers so they really understand how critical this issue is for folks with disabilities and their obligation to step up and help create resources to specifically help people, not just general housing resources, but there needs to be housing designated for people with disabilities to access because it's that difficult. And so I'm wondering if you're involved in those conversations with cities or the county and are there places for us to plug in so that the folks Lana and Kelly and that they're working with on the front lines can feed those stories back to those decision makers so they really understand like, oh, this is way more complex and nuanced than we actually understood. And we actually have to do a better job for a specific population of people.
Mm-hmm. Amen. So I know you and I with the Idaho Access Project, one of the areas we're focusing on is presenting information about this issue to the American Planning Association, to the Rocky Mountain Land Use Institute, to policymakers and architects, builders, developers. We need to do more of that. And I think part of it is framing that conversation in a way that makes sense to people who are building and financing housing and letting them understand that this expands their market share for the product. And by building accessible or visitable subdivisions, that expands their market share. I also see that Tara has a question. I want to make sure and get to her question.
Thank you, Eric. My question is there currently any financial incentive for housing providers to provide housing for people with disabilities? I mean, kind of similar to like if you hire someone with a disability, there's like write-offs or whatnot on taxes. Is there currently anything like that related to housing?
I'm not aware of anything specific to disability or specific to a protected class in the state of Idaho. I know that in Portland and maybe other places, there are developers that are building housing that is specifically addressing the needs of a certain audience. Like there's for people who are homeless, for instance, or without housing, or single moms with kids who need that support network, that social capital with other single moms. There's another project in Portland for that. I think that, Jeremy and the other folks at the Access Project and some of the folks we work with, we have this conversation about the demand for housing that is, at the very least, follows visitable construction standards. And those are different from fair housing design and construction or other federal laws. These would apply to single family homes or subdivision developments. And I really like the way Jeremy sums up his situation where he and his wife bought a house. They had to spend money to make the home accessible. And not everybody can do that. And if the house had been designed and built to be visitable or accessible at the beginning, the cost is zero. The difference in cost is really almost zero. But it can be tens of thousands of dollars in costs to modify a home once it's built. And our friend Jane is in the same boat. She had to spend a lot of money to make her home in East Boise accessible. So, but Jeremy sums it up really well. He might be able to get in and out of his house, but if his neighbors invite him and his wife to go to dinner and their home has stairs, that limits their social interaction or their social network and social capital in that neighborhood. So it's important to think more broadly about this, and I think all of us can take steps to educate policymakers and, again, builders, developers, architects, planners, and lenders, people who are lending money. Because when you can create housing that is affordable and accessible and efficient, and it's also near transit and near the workplace, you reduce the overall housing costs for every resident. And that's what creates housing affordability in the long run. So it's a change in thinking that needs to happen on a broad scale. That's my opinion. And all of us have the potential to make connections with the people who make those decisions, and invite them into a conversation about the benefits of creating more access in housing and community development. But I will put in again, I'll put links to information about this alongside this presentation, and make sure everybody has a link to that, so you can explore that. And then I'll make sure my contact information is available. So if you have an idea or suggestion, let me know. I always like learning new stuff. So sorry about that. My wife just got home and my dog was very excited. So other questions people have, other things you want to talk about?
This is Steve. I wanted to share kind of an interesting situation. It's quite unique. Arizona has a special apartment complex that is actually designed specifically for deaf individuals. It's called Apache Trail Apartment Complex. And as I had mentioned, it is designed for deaf people in mind, and it's designed to increase the usability of those deaf renters who are moving to the area. So that design includes built-in flashing doorbells and other accommodations that typically deaf individuals use. However, there was actually a lawsuit brought against this apartment complex. And even though that was designed specifically for those who are deaf and hard of hearing, there were others that sued them because they wanted to be involved in that, and they wanted to be residents of that apartment complex. So kind of ironic that they actually ended up being sued because they were not accepting applications for those who didn't have a disability at the time, and kind of backwards thinking in a way, since that was designed for that. What I'm wondering is, for here in Idaho, I would love to see communities, builders build communities or apartment complexes that would be appropriate for deaf individuals and that would accommodate those. However, I know that there are other people who would want a piece of that pie still. So my question is it discrimination to design a space and to accept one specific type of disabilities over others, or to really design it for one and to not include other classes of disabilities?
That is a great question. And I know that for housing that is designated as housing for seniors or housing for people over 62 or over 65, as long as the majority, a certain percentage of that housing is occupied by people at or above a certain age, you can have that designated as senior housing. I don't know about other protected classes, and so it's worth exploring. And I think that what would be fascinating is to have this group and other stakeholders have a conversation about the ideal kind of housing design or community design, and the features that would be useful to the broader community, so that everyone can live everywhere, and you have the option of having a light beacon, a flashing light for fire alarm, or some other accommodation that just comes with every apartment or every house, or can be easily installed. I think that would be an interesting conversation, and then provide that set of findings to the building contractors, to the Association of Planners, and anyone else that deals with housing development. I'd be happy to participate in that discussion.
Well, and this is Jeremy. You also will have, you'll have folks who are deaf or hard of hearing who use wheelchairs, or might have a developmental disability, or might be blind, so really it's so diverse, like when you start thinking about it, you really do have to design that building to be really fully accessible, because the disability types are just, there's so much crossover that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Yeah.
But sometimes you do kind of just want a compound of folks with disabilities, so that you can kind of just exist in that equalized world a little bit. When you go to any of the national conferences focused on disability, and you go in a room with 400 people who all have different types of disabilities, and you just see the kind of the change in the environment and space and attitude, and it's really amazing. And so it is kind of like, how do we achieve something like that, space like that?
Agreed.
So I totally understand that. I appreciate that.
Well, I'd like to invite everybody here to think about a future conversation like this, as we kind of move forward. What do we need to consider, and how do we present that information to people who make decisions about housing? So I'd like to keep that conversation open, and maybe we can set up a regular time. We can add it to our regular list of meetings, Jeremy. So I'm going to go back and share a couple of final screens, assuming nobody has any burning questions. And then we'll wrap up. Okay, so I've just got a couple more screens here to share. This is specific to what Idaho Housing and Finance Association, or IHFA, that's who I work for. This is what we are involved with. IHFA administers federal housing programs, and we partner with the Idaho Department of Commerce to conduct related planning and reporting. Now, this is relevant to the conversation we just had. The upcoming 2021 State of Idaho Analysis of Impediments will assess barriers to housing in several ways: a sample review of zoning ordinances, stakeholder surveys, and guess what? You guys are all going to get a stakeholder survey. So you'll have a chance to contribute your thoughts, and then key person interviews. The AI contractor, the Analysis of Impediments contractor, is Root Policy Research. They will reach out to the ADA 30 Idaho stakeholders for your perspective on barriers to housing and housing services. So this is a chance to, again, provide some of that feedback and make suggestions for what we need in Idaho. It's a starting point. Some of the resources available, I've mentioned fairhousingforum.org. I manage content for that website. Started that back in 2007. And it's a clearinghouse of information. If any of you have issues that you'd like to post on fairhousingforum.org, please let me know. You'll have my email address at the end of this. We also have at idahohousing.com/fair-housing, we have information on fair housing on IHFA's website. And then finally, HUD.gov/fair housing is another great area for resources. And you can see this, there's a picture on the right side of this slide. It's a screenshot of fairhousingforum.org, and it shows a list of topics on the right side, and then some basic introductory information in the middle, with the logo up on the upper left. And at the bottom is the title to an article describing sexual harassment complaint filed against a New Jersey property owner. So we mentioned that earlier. I just wanted to call your attention to that. So I try to put in topics of interest that talk about current case law, current issues involving fair housing. And then additional resources, I've got the screenshots of 3 different web-based resources. For more information, there's a HUD-approved training called The Basics of Fair Housing that's presented by HUD's Christina Miller. She goes into much more detail on fair housing law, talks about all the protected classes, all the prohibited actions, and it's a very comprehensive look at fair housing. There's a direct link to that video. And then to understand the week that led to the signing of the Fair Housing Act in the 60s, you can look at a video called 7 Days. I've got a link to that. It's fascinating. It's the 7 days between the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the signing of the Fair Housing Act a week later. And finally, to understand what the Fair Housing Act was created to address, you can look at or experience the video Segregated by Design. And it talks about redlining and some of the historic barriers that have been put up, that keep a lot of people out of housing and prevent them from acquiring and transferring generational wealth, to their kids and their grandkids. It's a really well done video. It's about 17 minutes. And then finally, here's a ton of information. I'll describe what's on the screen here. For more information, you can follow us on Facebook at Fair Housing Forum. You can also follow Idaho Housing on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter at Fair House Forum or at Idaho Housing. And the Idaho Access Project is also on Twitter. I think I'm following a lot of you guys, and that is at ID Access Project on Twitter. And then we have a YouTube channel, and I've got links to our English language videos and our Spanish language videos. In the center, I've got screenshots from a couple of videos. One says fair housing means access. Below that is fair housing means freedom from harassment, which we talked about. And on the right side, you can request printed materials. And I really encourage you, we're having a special in the next 7 days. You can get as many of these print materials as you want, because we need to use them up before the end of the grant. And that's on the 30th. So please order some print materials or forever live a life of regret. Finally, we've got the logos for Idaho Housing and Finance Association, kind of in the middle at the top. And then on the top right, we've got the logo for IdahoFairHousingForum.org. And that's the end of the session, or the end of the slides. So I'll stop that sharing. And it's been a really great group. I appreciate your questions and your participation today. And hopefully we'll have thousands of fans, down the road that'll watch this and learn from it. So anything else before we wrap up?
I don't think so.
The only thing I would say is I'm excited. I know Stephen has been involved in conversations with the city of Boise, and we've been trying to figure out what an advisory council or committee or some disability entity in the city could look like. And part of that conversation is, well, what would it focus on and what would it do? And I think this conversation is a perfect example of some of the issues that, as we talk about a city for everyone, what that committee could focus on, and those conversations that aren't just about the ADA, but are really about what are the things beyond the ADA that would make our city really a city for everyone. And housing is such a huge part of that. So I would love to keep this conversation going. I think it's exactly the kind of ideas that municipalities need to hear, and that will actually get us closer to being really, a city that's way more inclusive than it is right now. So I super appreciate this and the work you put into it.
Well, you're welcome. And I really enjoy the work we've all been able to do over the last year, or actually decades for some folks, and hope to continue that going forward. So I'm going to send all of you links to the first person videos we just recorded. Like I mentioned, we got, Jen Grushdale is one of them. Diana Willis is one of the interviews, and some of the folks that you're all familiar with. And before I share those, though, I'm going to make sure all of them have captions. So whoever made that comment on the video, thank you. I just have to carve out some time to get all the things done. So anyway, thanks everybody, and have a great week, and hope we run into each other soon. You guys take care.
Nice job, man.